The lamplight promise a Christmas sleep story. Welcome before we begin tonight. And number X 2019. One's tale, I invite you to find your most comfortable position. Perhaps you are nestled beneath warm blankets, their weight like a gentle embrace. Perhaps you are seated in your favorite chair by a window where snowflakes drift past like fallen stars, each one unique and perfect in its brief moment of visibility before it joins its fellows on the ground below. Wherever you are, whatever burdens you have carried through this day, allow yourself now to set them down. They will still be there tomorrow if you need them. But for now, for this space of time that belongs only to you and to this story, you may release them. Take a slow breath in, drawing the air deep into your lungs. And as you release it, feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Feel your jaw unclench, your brow smooth, your hands relax where they rest. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, no problem you must solve in this moment. Let my voice be your gentle companion as we journey together into a story of winter and wonder, of strangers who become friends, of forgotten joy remembered, and of the quiet magic that lives in human hearts when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and real with one another. The night outside your window is peaceful, or if it is not, let the peace of this story create a haven for you, a shelter from whatever storms you face. The world around you grows still or grows distant, fading like a dream upon waking. And now, as you settle more deeply into comfort and rest, our story begins. It begins as so many of the best stories do, with an ending and number X 2014, with plans disrupted, with paths blocked, with the comfortable and expected giving way to something strange and new. Part 1, Lost in the City. Chapter 1, The Last Omnibus. The Bells of Street. Paul and number X 2019. S had long since marked the hour of 7 when the last omnibus of the evening rattled its weary way through the frost-bitten streets of London. The great dome of the cathedral had already vanished into the gathering darkness, swallowed by fog and the smoke of 10,000 chimneys, and the shops along the Strand were closing their shutters one by one, their proprietors hurrying home to firesides and families, to Christmas Eve suppers and the comfort of familiar walls. The gas lamps had been lit at number X 2014, those modern marvels that had replaced the old oil lamps of earlier decades and number X 2014, their yellow flames dancing behind their glass prisons, casting trembling circles of light upon the cobblestones that gleamed with a thin sheen of ice. It was the sort of cold that crept into bones and settled there, the sort that made breath visible and turned fingers stiff and clumsy, the kind of cold that made every person on the street walk faster, heads down, shoulders hunched, thinking only of reaching their destinations and the warmth that waited there. Above, the sky was that peculiar darkening gray that presages snow, and indeed, if one looked closely, tiny flakes had already begun to fall, so small and tentative that they seemed uncertain whether they had permission to become a proper snowfall. The omnibus itself was a battered specimen of its kind, painted in what had once been a cheerful green, but which had faded through years of service to something closer to the color of old moss or aged copper. Its wooden sides bore the scars of countless journeys and number X 2014, scratches and dents and patches where the paint had been touched up by hands more concerned with economy than artistry. One of the windows had a crack running across it like a frozen lightning bolt, and another had been mended with a piece of oiled paper that rustled in the draft. The seats were worn smooth by the passage of countless passengers, the upholstery long since given up any pretense of comfort. The horses that pulled it were as weary as the vehicle itself, their breath steaming in plumes that looked almost solid in the cold air, their heads hanging low with the patient resignation of beasts who know that rest is coming, eventually, if they can only endure a little longer. Their hooves struck the cobblestones with a rhythmic clatter that had become, for the passengers inside, less a sound than a sensation, a background percussion to their thoughts that they had long since stopped consciously hearing. Within the omnibus and number X 2019, S drafty interior sat the remnants of the day and number X 2019. That's commerce and toil, each passenger wrapped in their own particular variety of exhaustion and thought. The benches, worn smooth by countless previous occupants, were hard and cold, despite the thin padding that remained, and the floor was tracked with melting snow and mud brought in on the boots of those who had boarded at earlier stops. A draft crept in through every crack and seam, finding its way beneath coat collars and through the gaps in gloves, through the spaces where buttons had been lost and not replaced, making the passengers huddle deeper into their wraps and wish, futilely, for warmer clothing or shorter journeys, or both. There was the lamplighter, Edmund Blackwood, a man of perhaps 50 winters, though the hardness of his life had aged him beyond his years. His shoulders had grown round from decades of ascending ladders with his lamp pole balanced on his shoulder, and his hands bore the permanent stains of lamp oil and soot no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. His eyes, a pale blue that might once have been striking, had developed a permanent squint from years of peering into flames to check their burning, and there were deep creases at their corners that spoke of countless evenings watching the sunset and the darkness rise. He sat near the rear of the omnibus, his worn leather satchel clutched upon his lap, watching the passing shops with the absent gaze of one who had traveled this route 10,000 times before and expected to travel it 10,000 times again until either he or the route came to an end. His coat, though clean and carefully mended, was thin in places where the fabric had worn through. His boots, though well polished, had been resoled so many times that the leather uppers were now attached to their third or perhaps fourth set of soles. Everything about him spoke of a man who took care of what little he had, who understood the value of things and the importance of making them last. In his satchel were his tools and number X 2014, matches, a small flask of oil, a length of wick, a knife for trimming and number X 2014, and a crust of bread wrapped in paper, saved from his midday meal for his supper, for he was a man who had learned early that one never knew when the next meal might come. Across from him perched a young governess, Miss Charlotte Ashby, no more than 23 years of age, though her severe manner and tightly pinned hair suggested she wished to appear older, more established, more worthy of the respect that so rarely came to young women in her position. She held a small carpet bag with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles from gripping it so tightly, and her jaw was set with the determination of a woman who had learned early that the world would take advantage of any softness she might show, any momentary lapse in vigilance. Her cloak, though clean and carefully mended and number X 2014. Indeed, she had spent the previous evening repairing a torn seam by candlelight, straining her eyes over the close work, and number X 2014 had been turned twice and let out at the seams. And even so, it was growing too tight across the shoulders as her body finished its transformation from girlhood to womanhood. The winter cold had found every thin place in the fabric to press its icy fingers through, and she had long since lost feeling in her toes despite the newspaper she had stuffed into her boots for extra insulation. A practical woman, Miss Ashby, who did what was necessary and did not complain, though the cost of such practicality was written in the tightness around her mouth and the shadows beneath her eyes. In her carpet bag were the modest possessions she had brought with her to the city 2 years ago, when she had left her village to seek employment. A change of clothing, a prayer book her mother had given her, a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, and the remains of her quarterly wages after paying for her room and board and sending what she could spare to her widowed father, who was too old and ill now to work his small plot of land. The bag also contained a small gift she had scraped together coins to purchase, and number X 2014. A handkerchief with embroidered flowers for the lady of the house where she was employed, a gesture of gratitude she hoped might secure her position for another year. Near the front of the omnibus slouched a street musician, Thomas Brennan, his fiddle case propped between his knees and his breath coming out in small white puffs that spoke of both the cold and the cheap gin he had consumed earlier in the evening to combat it. His fingers, roughened and callous from the strings, drummed in absent rhythm upon the case. And number X 2014, some melody only he could hear, some tune that lived perpetually in his mind whether he willed it or no, as persistent as a heartbeat or the memory of a face once loved. He was younger than Edmund, but older than Charlotte, perhaps 35, though dissipation had marked him in ways that made his age difficult to determine with certainty. His coat had once been fine in number X 2014, Good wool, well-tailored, and number X 2014. But that had been in another life, when he had still believed that talent and hard work would be enough, before disappointment and rejection had taught him otherwise. Now the coat was stained and missing buttons, and there was a tear in one sleeve that he had attempted to mend with thread that did not quite match. His hair, once carefully combed, now fell in lank strands across his forehead, and there was a hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals and too much reliance on liquid sustenance. The fiddle in its case was the one thing he had not pawned, though he had been tempted more than once when the rent was due or his stomach was too empty to ignore. It was a cheap instrument purchased secondhand from a pawnbroker years ago, its varnish chipped and its strings prone to breaking at the most inconvenient moments. But it was his livelihood, such as it was, and more than that, it was the last remaining connection to a younger self who had dreamed of concert halls and appreciative audiences, who had believed that beauty mattered and that the world would reward those who created it. And there, too, sitting bolt upright as if the very act of relaxation might constitute a moral failing, was Mrs. Henrietta Caldwell, a widow of considerable self-importance and modest means, who wore her respectability like armor and her mourning like a banner. She clutched her reticule with both hands, occasionally casting disapproving glances at the street musician, and number X 2019, S Slouch and the Lamplighter, and number X 2019, S Common Boots, at the way the young governess allowed her hair to escape from its pins, at the state of the omnibus floor, and the manners of the conductor, and the general decline of standards in modern London. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, though she would have been offended if anyone had suggested she looked even a day past 45. Her dress was black, as it had been for the 3 years since her husband and number X 2019 death, but it was a good black silk that rustled when she moved and had been carefully maintained to show that while she might be in mourning, she was not in poverty. Her bonnet was trimmed with jet beads that caught the lamplight and threw it back in tiny sparkles, and her gloves were kidskin, though they had been darned at the fingertips more than once. In her reticule were calling cards, a handkerchief with her initials embroidered in the corner, a small purse containing exactly enough coins for her omnibus fare, plus a modest sum for emergencies, and a letter from her sister inviting her to Christmas Eve supper. The letter had been read and reread so many times that the creases were beginning to tear, though Mrs. Caldwell would have denied that she was lonely or that she looked forward to this evening with anything more than polite anticipation. She was going, she told herself, out of duty, because her sister had invited her and it would be rude to refuse, that she had thought of little else for the past week, that she had planned her outfit with more care than such a simple family supper warranted, that she had even purchased a small gift for each of her sister and number X 2019. S children despite her carefully maintained budget and number X 2014. These facts she did not examine too closely. The omnibus lurched and swayed as it turned onto a narrower street, the motion causing Mrs. Caldwell to grab at the seat in front of her for balance, and making the street musician and number X 2019 S fiddle case slide slightly to one side. The conductor, a grizzled fellow with a nose that had been broken more than once and never properly set, and a voice made hoarse by years of shouting over the din of traffic and weather, called out the names of stops in a mechanical drone that suggested he had long since stopped hearing his own words, and number X 201, C, Cheapside, Poultry Bank, Cornhill, Leadenhall, and number X 201D. But few passengers stirred at these announcements. Most had already alighted at earlier stops, leaving only this small, weary collection who were bound for the eastern quarters of the city, or perhaps beyond, to homes and suburbs that were only just beginning to spread out from London and number X 2019, S dense center. With each stop they passed, the streets grew narrower and less familiar, the shops smaller and less prosperous, the lamplight more sparse, and the shadows deeper between each pool of illumination. It was into one of these shadows that the omnibus suddenly lurched with a violence that sent Mrs. Caldwell and number X 2019 S reticule tumbling to the floor, its contents scattering across the dirty boards, and calls the street musician and number X 2019. Lets fiddle case to slide forward with an alarming clatter that made him grab for it with a bitten-off curse. The young governess was thrown against the wall of the vehicle hard enough to bruise her shoulder, and Edmund the lamplighter found himself nearly unseated, saved only by his quick grip on the bench in front of him. The omnibus shuddered, listing suddenly to one side like a ship taking on water, and came to a complete and final stop with a grinding noise that spoke eloquently of something essential having given way. The driver and number X 2019, S voice, raised in anger and frustration, drifted back through the small forward window, muffled but still comprehensible, and number X 201C blasted axle. That and number X 2019, S, torn it proper, split clean through, and number X 201D. The conductor heaved himself down from his perch with a grunt of effort, his breath visible in great white clouds, and disappeared into the street. After a moment at number X 2014, a moment during which the passengers looked at one another with varying degrees of alarm, confusion, and resignation, and number X 2014, the door swung open to admit a blast of bitter wind that cut through the omnibus like a knife through butter, carrying with it a swirl of snow that had grown considerably more assertive since they had begun their journey. The conductor and number X 2019 C face appeared in the opening, red with cold and sheepish with apology, and number X 201C, begging your pardons, ladies and gentlemen, and number X 201D, he announced, his breath frosting in the lamplight so thickly that his words seemed to take visible form, and number X 201C, but we and number X 2019 will be going no further tonight. The front axle and number X 2019, S cracked clean through, split right down the middle it is, and there and number X 2019, S no mending it, not in this cold, not in the dark, not with the tools we have to hand. You and number X 2019 need to make your own ways home from here. I and number X 2019 am that sorry for the inconvenience, truly I am. But there and number X 2019, S nothing for it. And number X 201D. A collective groan rose from the passengers, though it was less a sound of surprise than of weary acceptance. Of course this would happen. Of course, on Christmas Eve, when everyone was trying to reach their destinations before the holiday truly began, of course the omnibus would break down and strand them in an unfamiliar part of the city. Was this not simply the nature of existence? To have one and number X 2019, S plans disrupted, one and number X 2019, S hopes disappointed, one and number X 2019, says carefully arranged schedules thrown into disarray by circumstances beyond one and number X 2019. Says, control? Edmund the lamplighter merely sighed, the sound emerging from deep in his chest, heavy with the accumulated weight of 5 decades of broken axles and altered plans, of promises unkept and hopes deferred. He had long ago learned that life was an endless succession of such disappointments, that the best one could do was to bear them with as much grace as possible and continue putting one foot in front of the other until the inevitable end came. He gathered his satchel and prepared to descend. Charlotte, the governess, went, if possible, even paler than her natural complexion, the blood draining from her face so completely that for a moment she looked almost ghostly in the dim lamplight. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating the distance to her lodgings, trying to remember the turns and streets she would need to navigate, counting and recounting the few coins remaining in her purse, and wondering if they would be enough for another conveyance, if she could find one, if any were still running at this hour on Christmas Eve. The thought of walking through unfamiliar streets in the dark and cold, alone, with her small bag containing everything of value she owned, made her stomach clench with a fear she would never have admitted aloud. Thomas the street musician laughed, a short bark of sound that held no humor whatsoever, only a kind of bitter recognition. Of course this would happen to him. Had anything in his life ever gone according to plan? He reached into his coat for his flask, found it empty, and number X 2014. He had finished it an hour ago. He remembered now, and number X 2014, and laughed again, the sound even hollower than before. He stood, swaying slightly, and collected his fiddle case, preparing to face whatever came next, with the resigned courage of one who has been disappointed so many times that fresh disappointment no longer has the power to wound. And Mrs. Henrietta Caldwell drew herself up to her full height in number X 2014, which was not considerable, but she had long ago learned that dignity was not a matter of physical stature but of bearing in number X 2014, and took a deep breath that made her corseted bosom heave with indignation. Her face flushed with color, contrasting sharply with her pale widow, and number X 2019, DZ bonnet, and her eyes flashed behind her pince nez, and number X 201C. This is intolerable. And number X 201D. She declared to no one in particular, her voice sharp with outrage, and number X 201C. Absolutely intolerable. What manner of service is this? What sort of company operates vehicles in such poor repair? I have paid my fare in good faith, and I have every right to expect to be delivered to my destination. I shall write to the company. I shall make my complaints known in the most vigorous terms. I shall, and number X 2014, and number X 201D. But her words were lost, swallowed by the wind and the general rustling and movement as the other passengers, having no desire to stand in a broken omnibus, listening to grievances that would change nothing, began to gather their belongings and file out into the winter night. The conductor offered his hand to each as they descended, an oddly courtly gesture from one so rough in appearance, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he helped first Charlotte, then Mrs. Caldwell down the steep step to the street. Soon, the small party found themselves standing upon a corner they had never intended to visit, huddled in a loose group as if the proximity of other human beings might provide some protection against the cold and the gathering darkness. They watched in silence as the omnibus conductor led his horses away into the night, the damaged vehicle listing sadly to one side, one wheel dragging, leaving a scraped trail in the thin snow that had begun to accumulate. The sound of the horses and number X 2019, hooves faded gradually, swallowed by distance and the thickening snowfall, until at last they were alone, utterly, completely alone, in a part of London none of them recognized, on a night when the temperature was dropping by the minute and the snow was beginning to fall in earnest. Chapter 2. Among Strangers. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply stood there on the corner, four strangers thrown together by circumstance, each taking stock of their situation and finding it less than ideal. The wind had picked up, driving the snow almost horizontally down the narrow street, and what had begun as occasional flurries was rapidly developing into something more serious. Already the cobblestones were beginning to disappear beneath a thin white blanket, and the gas lamps that lined the street cast pools of yellow light that made the falling snow look like swarms of tiny moths hurling themselves toward the flames. And number X 201C, well, and number X 201D, said Edmund at last, pulling his thin coat tighter around himself in a futile gesture against the cold, and number X 201C, I suppose we and number X 2019, D best determine where we are. Can, and number X 2019. T simply stand here all night, growing frozen to the pavement, and number X 201D. His voice, roughened by decades of shouting instructions to apprentices and responses to supervisors, nevertheless held a note of calm practicality that seemed to steady the others slightly. He was, after all, a man who had spent most of his life working outdoors in all weathers, who had climbed icy ladders and dealt with frozen lamp mechanisms on nights far colder than this. If he was not panicked, perhaps there was no need for panic. They looked around, really looked, for the first time since the omnibus had abandoned them. The street was narrow and dim, narrower than the main thoroughfares they had been traveling along earlier, and lined with shops that had long since shuttered their windows for the night and hung their closed signs. A baker, a greengrocer, a milliner, a shop selling books and stationery, another whose faded sign was too worn to read clearly, and number X 2014, all closed, all dark, all locked against the night and the weather, and any who might need assistance. The buildings themselves were old, older than much of London, built in an earlier century when the city had been smaller and this quarter had been something other than what it was now. They leaned toward each other across the narrow street like old gossips, sharing secrets, their upper stories nearly touching, blocking out what little remained of the evening sky. Here and there, a window showed light in number X 2014. Families at their suppers probably, or gathered around fires for the holiday in number X 2014. But these lights seemed distant and unreachable, belonging to a world that had nothing to do with the 4 cold, lost people on the street below. The snow continued to fall, each flake small and hard and driven by the wind to strike exposed skin with tiny needles of cold. Charlotte had pulled her thin shawl up over her head, but it provided little protection, and already her face was numb, and her hands, even in her mended gloves, had lost all feeling. She stamped her feet, trying to keep the blood flowing, and hugged her carpet bag closer to her chest, as if it might provide some warmth beyond its modest bulk. In the distance, church bells began to toll in number X 2014, 8 clear strokes that rang out across the city, marking the hour, though which church and how far away, none of them could say with certainty. The sound seemed to emphasize their isolation rather than provide comfort, a reminder that the world was going about its business while they were adrift in this forgotten corner. And number X 201C, I dawn, and number X 2019, T know this quarter, and number X 201D, Charlotte admitted at last, her voice tight with barely suppressed worry that threatened to spill over into something more panicked if she allowed it. And number X 201C, I, and number X 2019, I've never been this far east. At least I dawn and number X 2019. T think we and number X 2019. Ray East. I can and number X 2019. T tell, I thought I knew London reasonably well, but I and number X 2019. I've never seen this street before. None of these shop names are familiar, and number X 201D, and number X 201C, East, and number X 201D. Mrs. Caldwell repeated the word emerging as something between a question and an exclamation of horror. And number X 201C. Surely not. Surely this cannot be the Eastern Quarter. That would mean we and number X 2019 V traveled entirely in the wrong direction. My sister lives to the west, in Kensington, in a perfectly respectable neighborhood, and I was assured, absolutely assured by the conductor when I boarded that this omnibus traveled westward from the city center. How can we possibly be to the east? And number X 201D, and number X 201C, the conductor, and number X 201D. Thomas interrupted with a sardonic grin that twisted his thin face into something between amusement and bitterness. And number X 201C is halfway to whatever warm tap room or cold bed awaits him at the end of his shift, no doubt celebrating his freedom from his passengers and thinking not at all about our predicament. We and number X 2019. We on our own here, madam, well and truly, and standing here debating compass points and the reliability of omnibus conductors 1 and number X 2019 don't make us any warmer or any less lost. What we need is shelter, a fire if we can find one, and someone who can tell us where in God and number X 2019 what we need and how to get to where we need to be. And number X 201D. Edmund, who had been studying the buildings around them with the careful attention of someone accustomed to navigating the city at night, to reading the signs and landmarks that remained visible even in darkness, suddenly raised one arm and pointed. Down a side street, barely visible through the driving snow, was a glow of warm yellow light, steady and inviting, quite unlike the cold blue-white flicker of the gas lamps. And number X 201C, there, and number X 201D, he said, his voice taking on a note of relief. And number X 201C, that and number X 2019, S lamplight, old-fashioned lamplight from the look of it, oil or candle, and where there and number X 2019. Less lamplight burning at this hour on Christmas Eve, there are people who might be willing to help, or at the very least, who might allow us to warm ourselves for a moment and collect our bearings. Perhaps someone can direct us, or tell us where we might find a hackney cab, or at minimum give us shelter until the worst of this snow passes. And number X 201D. It seemed a sensible suggestion, the only sensible suggestion anyone had made. And so, with no better options presenting themselves and the cold growing more penetrating with each passing minute, the small group began to make their way toward the light. Charlotte clutched her carpet bag tighter and hurried forward, her boots slipping slightly on the snow-covered cobblestones. Mrs. Caldwell gathered her skirts in one hand and her reticule in the other and picked her way carefully, her face set in lines of determined dignity. Thomas tucked his fiddle case under one arm and shambled along, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the wind. And Edmund, drawing on reserves of endurance built over decades of working in all weathers, simply put his head down and walked steadily forward, leading the way as he had so often led apprentices and fellow workers on dark nights, when lamps needed tending and someone needed to show the way. The wind seemed to push at their backs, as if eager to hurry them along, to speed them toward whatever destination awaited. The snow fell faster, beginning to accumulate in earnest now, piling in small drifts against doorsteps and gathering in the crevices and corners of the buildings. Their footprints filled in almost as soon as they made them, and within minutes there would be no trace that they had passed this way at all. As they drew closer to the source of the light, it revealed itself gradually, emerging from the snow and shadows like something materializing from a dream. It was a shop of some kind, though what kind was not immediately apparent. It was small, surprisingly small, wedge-shaped and squeezed between two larger buildings, as if it had been an afterthought in the neighborhood and number X 2019. W was construction, as if someone had noticed a narrow gap between structures and decided to fill it with this odd little establishment rather than leave empty space. The building itself was old, older perhaps than its neighbors, built of dark brick that had weathered to an almost black patina in places, with windows of old glass that warped and rippled the view of the interior. A sign hung above the door, suspended from a wrought iron bracket that creaked softly in the wind, though the words upon the sign were so faded and worn that none of them could quite make out what they said. The letters seemed to shift and swim before their eyes, refusing to resolve into anything fully readable, as if the shop itself was uncertain what it wanted to be called. But the windows glowed with warm yellow light, a light that spoke of candles and oil lamps and fires burning in hearths, a light that seemed to carry with it the promise of warmth and perhaps kindness. And through the slightly warped glass they could see glimpses of the interior, shelves lined with objects whose nature was unclear from this distance, and at the back of the shop a figure moving about in the gentle, unhurried manner of one who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to accomplish whatever small tasks occupied them. Edmund reached the door first and paused with his hand on the handle, looking back at the others as if seeking confirmation that this was indeed what they wanted to do, that entering this strange shop was the correct course of action. They nodded, stamping snow from their boots, huddling closer together against the wind. What choice did they have, really? It was this, or continue wandering in the snow, and none of them were dressed warmly enough for that. None of them had any idea where they were going, and the night was only growing colder. Edmund pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead as the door swung inward, a pure, crystalline sound that seemed to hang in the air longer than any ordinary bell had a right to, as if the note were reluctant to fade, as if it wanted to linger and be appreciated. The sound cut through the wind and snow with a clarity that was almost shocking, and for a moment all four of them paused on the threshold, arrested by that single perfect note. Then the warmth of the shop reached out to embrace them, rolling over them in a wave that made them gasp with relief and pleasure. It was not merely warm, it was perfectly warm, the exact temperature that a human body craves after being too long in the cold. And with the warmth came scents and number X 2014. Oh, such scents and number X 2014. That made them draw in deep breaths without thinking, their bodies responding to the smells before their minds could catalog what they were sensing. There was cinnamon, yes, and cloves, the traditional spices of Christmas, and the clean, sharp scent of pine needles, and beneath these the ghost of wood smoke, old and mellow and comfortable. But there were other scents too, less easily named, old leather and beeswax candles, the musty sweetness of old books, and the metallic tang of brass that had been polished until it gleamed, the dusty smell of fabric that had been stored for a long time, and the waxy scent of crayons or colored pencils, the faint bitter aroma of tea leaves and the yeasty warmth of bread baked earlier in the day. And beneath all of these, woven through them like a thread through cloth, was something else entirely, something that defied naming. It was the scent of time, perhaps, or memory, or hope, or all of these things mingled together. It was the smell of a place where important things had happened, where people had come seeking and found, where losses had been mourned and joy celebrated, where the ordinary and the extraordinary met and merged. And number X201C, come in, and number X201D, said a voice from somewhere at the back of the shop, gentle and welcoming, warmed by some quality that was more than mere friendliness, that spoke of genuine pleasure at their arrival. And number X201C, Dawn and number X2019. T stand there on the threshold letting all the winter in with you. Close the door and come into the warm. You look frozen through, all of you. And Christmas Eve is no night to be wandering about lost in the snow. And number X201D. They shuffled inside, suddenly awkward and self-conscious, stamping snow from their boots onto the mat just inside the door, brushing flakes from their shoulders and sleeves. The door swung shut behind them with a soft click that sounded remarkably final, as if something significant had just occurred, though what, none of them could have said. And so our four travelers have found shelter from the storm, though they do not yet know what they have truly found. Let your breathing slow now, matching the gentle rhythm of falling snow outside the shop, and number X2019. S windows. Let your body sink deeper into rest, as deep as the snow is beginning to pile in the forgotten corners of London. The story continues, but there is no hurry. Time moves differently in the shop on Lamplight Lane. Time moves at the pace of memory, of recognition, of hearts beginning to remember what they thought they had forgotten forever. Close your eyes and see the shop in your mind. The warm lamplight, the crowded shelves, the scent of cinnamon and old books. You are safe here, as our travelers are safe. Rest now, and let the story continue. Part 2. The Shop of Lost Things. Chapter 3. The Keeper of Memories. The shopkeeper emerged from behind a tall shelf laden with books of all sizes and descriptions, and proved to be a small, elderly man with a face as creased and comfortable as a favorite armchair, the sort of face that invited confidences and seemed incapable of harsh judgment. He wore a waistcoat of burgundy velvet that had seen considerably better days, its nap worn smooth in places, and one of its buttons replaced with another that did not quite match, but which somehow only added to its charm. His spectacles, perched on a nose that had a distinct sideways lean, suggesting some long-ago injury, caught the lamplight and threw it back in little stars that seemed to dance across his face when he moved his head. His hair, what remained of it, stood up in tufts about his ears like the down of a baby bird, white and fine as cobweb, as if he had recently run his hands through it in thought or perhaps in mild exasperation. His eyes, behind those spectacles, were a warm brown, deeply creased at the corners from decades of smiling, and they held that particular quality of kind shrewdness that comes to those who have spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its complexity and have decided, on balance, to think well of it despite ample evidence to the contrary. He moved with the careful deliberation of age, but there was nothing infirm about him, nothing that suggested weakness or inability. Rather, he moved as one who had learned that haste was rarely necessary, that most things worth doing were worth taking time to do properly, and that the journey was often more important than the destination. His hands, as he reached out to take Charlotte and number X2019, sweat shawl, were gnarled but gentle, marked by age spots and old scars, but still capable and sure in their movements. And number X201C, lost are you? And number 201D. He said, and though he phrased it as a question, his tone made it more a statement of observed fact. And number X201C. Well, that and number X2019. S how most people find this place, I find. Lost or looking for something they can, and number X2019. T quite name. Something they and number X2019. V mislaid along the way. Come now, all of you. Come away from that door and warm yourselves properly. There and number X2019. S.A. stove in the corner there and number X2014. You see it? That and number X2019. S the fellow and number X2014. And I and number X2019. VT Brewing, proper tea. None of your weak London dishwater, but good strong stuff. That and number X, 2019. All put warmth back in your bones. It and number X, 2019. S, a bitter night to be wandering about, bitter and getting bitterer, and you all look as though you could use a bit of kindness. And number X, 201D, Mrs. Caldwell drew herself up, her spine stiffening with automatic resistance, prepared to deliver a speech about the unsuitability of accepting refreshment from strangers, about propriety and appropriate behavior, and the maintenance of social boundaries. She had an entire arsenal of such speeches developed and refined over decades of navigating London society, of protecting her respectability and her reputation, of ensuring that no one could ever say she had done anything improper or forward or beneath her station. But even as she opened her mouth to speak, even as she prepared to politely but firmly refuse this offer of hospitality, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove in the corner reached her, wrapping around her like an embrace. And she realized, suddenly and completely, how cold she was, how thoroughly the winter had penetrated not just her clothing, but her very bones, how much she ached from it, how desperately she wanted nothing more than to be warm again, properly warm, warm all the way through. She compromised, as she had learned to do in life, accepting the offer, but maintaining her dignity. She took the cup of tea the shopkeeper pressed into her chilled hands, but remained standing rather than sitting, as if perching on one of the shop and number X2019. Its chairs or stools might constitute too great a surrender to circumstances, too complete an admission that she needed help, that she was not entirely in control of her situation. The others had no such compunctions, or perhaps they were simply too cold and too weary to maintain such fine distinctions of propriety. Edmund sank gratefully onto a low stool near the stove, his joints cracking audibly as he lowered himself down and wrapped his scarred, oil-stained hands around the chipped teacup the shopkeeper placed in them. The warmth seeping from the cup into his palms was almost painful after the numbing cold. But it was a good pain, the pain of circulation, returning, of life reasserting itself in flesh that had grown dangerously close to freezing. Charlotte perched on the edge of a chair whose stuffing was escaping through several small tears in its upholstery. Her carpetbag still clutched firmly in her lap, though her grip had loosened slightly, and accepted her tea with a murmured word of thanks that emerged as barely more than a whisper. Her hands shook as she lifted the cup to her lips. Whether from cold or from relief or from some combination of the two, she could not have said. Thomas leaned against a shelf, too restless even now to fully sit, his fiddle case propped carefully beside him where he could keep one hand on it, and accepted his tea with a nod of appreciation that was half surprise. He had not expected kindness from the world this evening. He had not expected kindness from the world in general for quite some time now. The world, in his experience, did not give away warmth and tea for free. There was always a price, always an expectation, always some payment demanded. He waited, wary, for the shopkeeper to name his terms. But the shopkeeper seemed to expect nothing beyond their acceptance of his hospitality. He bustled about, though, and number X2018, bustled and number X2019, was perhaps too energetic a word for his movements, which were more of a gentle pottering, refilling cups as they emptied, adding another shovelful of coal to the stove, adjusting the wick on one of the lamps to make it burn more brightly. He hummed as he moved, a tune that had no particular melody, but which was somehow soothing nonetheless. The sort of wordless music that spoke of contentment and the pleasure of having a task to do and the ability to do it well. And number X201C. We were on the omnibus and number X201D. Edmund explained after a few moments of warming silence, his voice gradually losing the hoarse rasp that the cold had given it. And number X201C. The omnibus from the city center, heading in number X2014. Well, we were all heading different directions, I suppose, but the omnibus was going east or west, or perhaps a bit of both. In any case, the axle broke, cracked clean through, the conductor said, and he left us at a corner not far from here. At least I, Dawn, and number X2019 think it was far from here, though in the snow it and number X2019. It's hard to judge distances. And the truth is, we and number X2019 none of us certain exactly where we are or how to get where we were going. This is and number X2019. T, a part of London any of us recognize. And number X201D. The shopkeeper nodded sagely, unsurprised, as if broken omnibus axles and stranded passengers were a common feature of his evening, as regular as the ticking of the various clocks that stood on shelves throughout the shop. In number X201C, you and number X2019, in Lamplight Lane, and number X201D, he said the words rolling off his tongue with a fond familiarity as if the name itself pleased him. And number X201C, though I don't and number X2019. T, expect you and number X2019. V, heard of it. It and number X2019. S, one of those streets that, and number X2019. S, only on some of the maps, if you take my meaning. The old maps, mostly, the ones drawn before the city got so big and complicated. And even on those maps, it and number X2019. It's often tucked away in a corner, easy to miss if you and number X2019. Not looking for it specifically. But you and number X2019. Safe enough here, perfectly safe. And welcome to stay as long as you need until the snow eases and you can see your way clear to wherever you and number X2019. We're bound. And number X201D. And number X201C. What manner of shop is this? And number X201D. Missus. Caldwell inquired, her voice recovering some of its natural sharpness now that warmth was returning to her body. Her tone suggested that while she was grateful for the tea, she was also suspicious of it, and of the shop, and of the shopkeeper himself. Her eyes, sharp behind her pince-nez, roved over the crowded shelves, trying to make sense of what she saw there. And number X201C. I see books, but also, and number X2014, are those mechanical toys? And surely that cannot be a ship in a bottle on that shelf. The bottle is far too small for the size of the ship. It defies all logical proportion. And number X201D, and number X201C. Ah, and number X201D, said the shopkeeper, and his eyes twinkled behind his spectacles, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in warm glints of amusement. And number X201C, well, that and number X2019. S because it and number X2019, S a special sort of shop, you see. Not the ordinary kind at all. I sell memories, in a manner of speaking. Or rather, I help people remember things they and number X2019, V forgotten, things they and number X2019, V lost along the way, perhaps put down somewhere and forgotten to pick up again, or set aside deliberately because they seemed too painful or too impractical to hold on to. I keep such things here, you see, until people are ready to claim them again. And number X201D. Thomas snorted softly, the sound emerging as half laugh, half cough. And number X201C. Memories are and number X2019. T something you can sell, old man. and number X201D. He said, but there was no real mockery in his voice, only a kind of weary skepticism born of disappointment. And number X201C, they and number X2019, re and here, and number X201D, he tapped his temple with one long finger, the nail bitten short and rimmed with dirt. And number X201C, either you have them or you don't. And number X2019, T. You can, and number X2019, T buy them in a shop like a pound of tea, or a new pair of gloves. And number X201D, and number X201C. True enough, and number X201D. The shopkeeper agreed mildly, not at all offended by the challenge. And number X201C. The memories are indeed in your head, in your heart, in your very bones. But sometimes, you see, they get buried under all the weight we carry, all the years and disappointments and small sorrows that accumulate like dust on a shelf, all the things we tell ourselves we must be and must do and must not feel. Sometimes people forget not the memory itself and number X2014. Oh no, the memory is still there, tucked away safely in number X2014. But they forget what it felt like, the warmth of it, the joy or the sadness or the wonder it once held. They remember the fact of the thing, but not the feeling of it. And that, I find, is a particularly lonely kind of forgetting. And number X201D. He moved about the shop as he spoke, his steps slow and measured, touching objects here and there with the casual affection of one greeting old friends, a music box, a faded photograph in a tarnished frame, a child and number X2019 S-toy that had been carefully mended, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. The shop was, now that they looked at it properly with eyes that had adjusted to the lamplight, an extraordinary jumble of items, a collection that defied all ordinary principles of organization or categorization. There were indeed books, hundreds upon hundreds of them, stacked on shelves that reached to the ceiling and piled in tottering columns on the floor and tucked into every available nook and corner. They were books of all kinds, leather-bound volumes with gold lettering on their spines, cheap paper-bound novels with lurid covers, children and number X2019, Et's picture books with worn pages, technical manuals and poetry collections and atlases and cookbooks and novels and histories. Some looked valuable, possibly quite valuable, while others appeared to be worth nothing beyond whatever sentimental attachment someone might have to them. But there were also mechanical toys and music boxes, their brass and steel mechanisms gleaming in the lamplight. Old photographs in frames both simple and ornate, showing faces that stared out at the shop with the solemn, slightly startled expressions common to early photography. Scraps of fabric in faded colors, buttons and ribbons and bits of lace, hand-drawn maps of places both real and imaginary, some carefully labeled, others cryptic and mysterious. Letters tied with ribbons or string, their paper yellowed with age, their ink faded but still legible. Toys and dolls and wooden puzzles. Pieces of china, some whole, some broken and carefully mended. Tools of various trades. A cooper and number X2019. S hammer, a seamstress, and number X2019. S thimble, a watchmaker, and number X2019. Let's loop. And there were objects so strange and particular that none of the visitors could name them at all or determine their purpose. A glass sphere filled with what appeared to be water and tiny glittering particles that swirled when moved. A carved wooden box with no apparent way to open it, its surface covered in intricate symbols. A brass device with gears and wheels that seemed to serve no mechanical purpose. A mirror whose surface showed reflections that were just slightly different from reality, as if showing the world as it might have been, rather than as it was. And number X201C. Each item here in number X201D. The shopkeeper continued, running one gnarled finger along the edge of a shelf as he walked. And number X201C holds a memory for someone. That music box there, for instance, and number X201D, and number X2014, he gestured to a small wooden box, inlaid with mother of pearl on a nearby shelf, and number X 2014 and number X 201C, belonged to a girl who danced to its tune every evening before bed. Every single evening, without fail, for years and years. She would wind it up and dance around her room in her nightgown, and her mother would stand in the doorway and smile to see such joy, such unself-conscious delight in movement and music. The girl grew up, as girls do, and somewhere along the way she forgot how it felt to dance simply for the joy of dancing, for the pleasure of her body moving to music, with no audience to judge and no purpose beyond the moment itself. The music box waited here until she found it again, until she was ready to remember. Now she dances with her granddaughter, and the joy has returned, passed down like an inheritance, and number X, 201D. Charlotte, despite herself, despite her determination to maintain her guard and her careful control, found her gaze drawn to a small leather-bound book on a shelf at eye level. It was not a large book, perhaps 6 inches tall and 4 inches wide, with a cracked spine and corners that showed the wear of much handling. The leather cover had once been red but had faded to a soft brownish pink, and the gilt letters on the spine had worn almost to illegibility, though she could just make out what might have been, and number X 2018, fairy tales and number X 2019, or possibly and number X 2018, fables and number X 2019. Something about it called to her, not loudly, not insistently, but with a quiet persistence that was impossible to ignore. Without quite realizing what she was doing, without making a conscious decision to move, she set down her teacup on a nearby table and reached for the book. Her fingers touched the worn leather, and a shock ran through her, not painful but startling, as if she had touched something far warmer or far colder than it should have been. The shopkeeper noticed and number X 2014. He seemed to notice everything, to be aware of every movement in his shop without appearing to pay particular attention to anything and number X 2014, but said nothing. He merely continued his gentle pottering, refilling teacups that had somehow become empty again, stirring the fire in the stove, adjusting a lamp here, straightening a pile of books there, humming his tuneless, soothing melody. Charlotte opened the book carefully, mindful of its fragile binding, her governess and number X 2019. That's training and handling books coming automatically even in this strange moment. Within were fairy tales, illustrated with delicate watercolors that had faded to soft pastels. A princess climbing a tower of glass, a fox speaking to a bird in a tree, a child following a path through dark woods, a mermaid watching ships from the safety of the waves. She recognized it at once. Or rather, she recognized what it represented, what it stood for, even if this exact book had never been hers. Your breathing is slower now, deeper, matching the rhythm of this quiet moment in the shop. Let yourself sink deeper still into rest, as Charlotte sinks into memory. The story continues, but there is no urgency. Time has stopped meaning what it meant before, outside in the cold streets of London. Here in the shop, time is measured in heartbeats and memories, in the space between one breath and the next. Rest now. Rest deeply. The story will carry you gently forward, and you need do nothing but listen. Chapter 4. The Book of Lost Bedtimes and number X 201C. I had a book like this and number X 201D, Charlotte said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, speaking almost to herself rather than to the others in the shop, and number X 201C, when I was small, when I was very, very small, before, and number X 2014, before everything changed. My mother would read from it every night before I slept. Every single night without fail, no matter how tired she was or how late the hour. She would sit on the edge of my bed and I would snuggle under the covers, and she would hold the book so we could both see the pictures, and she would read. And number X 201D. She turned a page and another, her fingers trembling slightly as they touched the old paper. The illustration swam before her eyes, blurring and then clearing, and with each image came a flood of memory so vivid and immediate that for a moment she was no longer standing in a strange shop, in an unknown part of London, but was instead 7 years old, tucked into her narrow bed in the cottage where she had grown up, listening to her mother and number X 2019, S voice and number X 201C. She would do all the voices and number X 201D. Charlotte continued, a smile beginning to form on her lips, tentative at first, but growing stronger, transforming her severe face into something younger, softer, more open. And number X 201C. Make them quite dramatic, different accents and pitches for each character. The giant would have a deep, booming voice that shook the rafters. The princess would sound high and sweet and just a little bit silly, which made her seem more real somehow, more like someone you might actually meet. The clever fox would have a knowing, sly quality that made you want to laugh, even before the joke came. And the wicked stepmother and number X 2014, oh, the wicked stepmother had a voice like vinegar and ice, and it made me shiver even though I knew I was safe, that it was only a story. And number X 201D. She was no longer aware of the others watching her, of Edmund sitting quietly on his stool, of Mrs. Caldwell standing stiffly but with her tea forgotten in her hands, of Thomas leaning against his shelf with something like wistfulness crossing his face. She was lost in memory, submerged in it as completely as if she had fallen into a river and been swept away by the current. And number X 201C. I used to laugh so hard sometimes. And number X 201D. She said, wonder creeping into her voice, as if she were discovering something she had not known was lost. And number X 201. C. Laugh so hard I could. And number X 2019. T. Breathe. Particularly during the funny parts, the stories about clever peasant boys who outwitted foolish kings, or silly goose girls who turned out to be wiser than they appeared. My mother would have to stop reading and wait for me to calm down, and she would be laughing too, both of us giggling like children, which I suppose I was, but she was not. Though in those moments, the distance between our ages seemed to vanish completely. We were simply two people sharing a story, delighting in it together. The world narrowed down to just the two of us and the book between us and the candlelight flickering on the walls. And number X 201D. The memory was so clear, so sharp in every detail, that Charlotte could smell the beeswax candle that had burned on her bedside table, could feel the weight and warmth of the quilt her grandmother had stitched, could hear the old house settling around them with its familiar creaks and sighs. She could see her mother and number X 2019, two-faced in the candlelight, still young then, unlined and healthy, with color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes. Her mother and number X 2019, S hair, the same dark brown as Charlotte and number X 2019. S own had been long then, worn in a simple braid over one shoulder, and Charlotte had loved to watch it catch the light, to reach up sometimes and touch it when her mother leaned close to show her a picture. And number X 201C. When did you last think of those evenings? And number X 201D. The shopkeeper asked gently, not interrupting so much as inviting her to continue, to go deeper into the memory. Charlotte blinked, coming partially back to the present, though one hand remained on the open page of the book, anchoring her to the past. And number X 201C. I and number X 2014. I Dawn and number X 2019. T. No and number X 201D. She admitted. And number X 201C. Years. Many years. Not since and number X 2014. Not since my mother fell ill. Not since she died. And number X 201D. She closed the book carefully, but kept it in her hands, holding it as she might hold something infinitely precious. And number X 201C. When she got sick, when the fever came and would, and number X 2019. T leave. Everything changed. I was 15. Old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to help care for her, but not old enough to prevent it or to prepare myself properly for what came after. We stopped reading together because she did and number X 2019. T have the strength. And then because I was too busy trying to manage the household and care for her and keep everything from falling apart. And then she was gone. And I had to leave school and find work. And there was no time for stories anymore. No Time for Anything That Was and Number X, 2019. T, Practical and Necessary, and Directed Toward Survival, and Number X, 201D. Her voice had grown tight, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned not to show emotion, not to let others see weakness or vulnerability, and Number X, 201C. I put away all the soft and childish things, and Number X, 201D, she said, and Number X, 201C, the fairy tales and the dreams and the laughter. I told myself I had to be serious, had to be responsible, had to be someone reliable and competent, because that was what the world required of me. That was what would keep me alive, what would get me positions and references and enough money to survive. There was no room for a Number X 2014 for joy. No space for remembering the girl who had laughed at silly stories and believed in happy endings. And Number X 201D. And Number X 201C. But the girl is still there. And Number X 201D. The shopkeeper said softly. And Number X 201C. In and Number X 2019, T-she. Buried perhaps beneath all the years and responsibilities and careful control, but still there, still waiting, still hoping that someday there might be room for her again, for laughter and stories and the warmth of someone reading aloud in the candlelight. And Number X, 201D. Charlotte looked down at the book in her hands, at its worn cover and faded spine, and felt something crack open in her chest. It was not a painful cracking, though there were tears suddenly blurring her vision. It was more like ice breaking in spring, like frozen ground beginning to thaw, allowing something long dormant to push its way toward the surface again. And Number X 201C. I miss her. And Number X 201D, she whispered, the emission torn from some deep place she had kept carefully locked. And Number X 201C. I miss my mother, not just the person she was when she was well, though I miss that terribly. But I miss the evenings we spent together, the stories we shared, the closeness of those moments. I miss who I was when I was with her, when I was allowed to be a child who laughed and dreamed and believed in magic. I and Number X 2019. I've spent so many years trying not to miss her, trying not to remember because the memories hurt, that I think I and Number X 2019. I've forgotten how much those evenings meant, how much joy there was, even in something as simple as reading together before sleep. And Number X 201D, the shop was very quiet. Even the clocks seemed to have paused in their ticking, as if time itself was holding its breath, honoring this moment of recognition and grief and remembering. Edmund and Number X 2019. S eyes were suspiciously bright, and he cleared his throat roughly, looking away. Mrs. Caldwell had set down her teacup and was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief, though she would have denied she was crying if anyone had been impolite enough to mention it. Thomas had gone very still, his face unreadable, but his hands had tightened on his fiddle case, as if needing something solid to hold on to. And Number X 201C. Keep the book. And Number X 201D. The shopkeeper said. And Number X 201C. It wants to be with you, I think. It wants to help you remember that you and Number X 2019 re not only a governess, not only a responsible young woman who survives by being serious and controlled. You and Number X 2019 re also still that child who loves stories and laughter. Both can be true. Both are true. Perhaps it and Number X 2019, it's time to let her come back, at least sometimes. To read aloud again, even if only to yourself or to the children you teach. To allow yourself moments of joy and silliness and wonder, not instead of being responsible, but alongside it. Because joy is not frivolous or childish. Joy is necessary. Joy is what makes survival worth the effort. And Number X 201D. Charlotte clutched the book to her chest, and for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to cry openly, without shame or apology, letting the tears fall freely as they wished. She cried for her mother, for the girl she had been, for all the years she had denied herself comfort and warmth and connection. She cried for the bedtime stories she had missed and would never have again, and for the possibility that perhaps, she might create new stories, new moments of connection and joy, even if they could never replace what had been lost. And as she cried, the others in the shop felt their own griefs and losses rising to the surface, their own memories demanding attention. The shop seemed to grow warmer still, the lamplight softer and more forgiving, as if the building itself was embracing them, making space for their sorrows and their hopes alike. Let yourself float now in the warmth of the shop, in the safety of this moment. Perhaps you too have memories that hurt to remember, memories you have buried because the pain of them seemed too great to bear. Perhaps you too have forgotten how to laugh, how to be soft, how to allow yourself joy. The story continues, gently carrying you forward, but for now simply rest in this knowledge, that grief and joy can exist together, that remembering what we have lost does not mean we cannot find new things to love. Rest now, breathe deeply. Let the story wash over you like a gentle tide. Chapter 5, The Lamplighter. Remembers Edmund the Lamplighter, watching the young governess and number X 2019. That's face transform as she held the book, felt something shift and crack within his own chest. Like ice that had been frozen solid for so long that he had forgotten it was ice at all, had come to believe it was simply how his heart naturally felt, cold and heavy and numb. He rose from his stool, his joints protesting after sitting still for too long in the warmth, and began to wander the shop himself, his practical, work-worn hands trailing along the edge of shelves, his pale eyes scanning the objects arranged there. He was not certain what he was looking for. Indeed, he had not consciously decided to search for anything at all. But the shop seemed to invite it, to encourage a certain gentle rummaging among its treasures, as if the right object might call out to the right person at the right moment, a form of recognition that had nothing to do with conscious seeking and everything to do with need and readiness meeting in that mysterious way that cannot be planned or forced. He paused to examine a mechanical toy, a tin soldier that would march if you wound the key in its back. He picked up a photograph of a stern-faced family posed before a house he did not recognize. He looked through a box of old buttons, each one different, each one holding some story he would never know. He opened a drawer and found it full of keys, hundreds of them, all different sizes and styles, none of them labeled, each one presumably opening some lock somewhere, though where and to what he could not guess. It was in a corner, on a low shelf near the floor where someone might easily overlook it if they were not looking closely, that he found it. A small brass lamp, no larger than his two fists together, with a glass chimney that had been carefully cleaned and polished until it shone like crystal. It was an old-fashioned oil lamp, the sort that had once lit every street corner before gas and electricity had come to make such simple flames obsolete. The sort Edmund himself had carried in his youth when he had first apprenticed to the lamplighter and number X 2019, strayed when his father had handed him his first lamp pole and sent him out to learn the work that had sustained their family for generations. He picked it up with careful hands, surprised by how familiar its weight felt, how perfectly it balanced in his palm, as if his muscles remembered this exact distribution of brass and glass and air. Even after decades of carrying different tools, more modern equipment, mechanisms that bore little resemblance to this simple flame keeper. The brass was cold at first touch, but as he held it, cradled it in both hands, it seemed to warm, as if remembering hands that had held it long ago, as if recognizing in Edmund someone who understood its purpose and its value. And number X 201C, I started as a lamplighter when I was 12 years old, and number X 201D, Edmund said aloud. Though he had not consciously decided to speak, the words simply came, drawn out by the lamp in his hands and the attentive silence of the shop, by the feeling that here, in this strange place, with these strange companions, truth was not only permitted but somehow required. And number X 201C. My father was a lamplighter before me, and his father before him, going back 3 generations at least, perhaps more. We didn't and number X 2019. Keep written records, but the stories were passed down father to son, along with the skills and the pride of the work. And number X 201D. The others had turned to listen, drawn by something in his voice, and number X, 2014, a quality that was both reminiscence and mourning. Memory and loss intertwined so completely that they could not be separated. And number X, 201C, it was honest work. And number X, 201D. Edmund continued, his voice growing stronger as the memories came flooding back, as vivid as if they had happened yesterday rather than nearly 40 years ago. And number X, 201C. Hard work, certainly. And number X, 2014. We worked in all weathers, in rain and snow and biting wind, climbing ladders that were slick with ice, carrying our lamps and our poles through streets that were dark as pitch once the sun went down. But it was important work, sacred work, in a way, though I would. And number X, 2019. Dot have used that word then. I was too young to think in such terms. But that and number X, 2019, S what it felt like, even if I didn't, and number X, 2019, T have the words for it. And number X, 201, D he turned the lamp in his hands, watching how it caught the light from the shop. And number X, 2019, S other lamps, how it seemed to glow from within even though no flame burned inside it now. And number X, 201C, each evening, as the sun went down and the shadows began to creep between the buildings and fill up the alleys, we, and number X, 2019, D, go out with our lamps and our ladders. My father and I, working our section of the city, and 100 other lamplighters and their apprentices and sons working theirs. We and number X, 2019. D go from corner to corner, from lamp to lamp, and we and number X, 2019. D bring light to the streets. We were the ones who kept back the darkness, you see. We were the ones who made the city safe for people to walk home by after their work was done. We were the ones who turned London from a frightening maze of shadows into a place where you could see your way clear. And number X, 201D, his voice had taken on a dreamy quality, as if he were seeing those old streets before him, lit one by lamps that blazed to life at his touch. And number X, 201C, there was a moment every evening when you and number X, 2019, D, light the first lamp on your route, the very first one, and you and number X, 2019, D, watch it catch and flare. Watch the flame take hold and steady, and begin to push back the gathering dark. And there was something almost, and number X, 2014, almost holy about that moment, as if you were keeping a promise to the city, to all the people in it, that we would, and number X, 2019, T, let the darkness win, that we and number X, 2019, D, stand watch over the night, and number X, 201, D, he paused, swallowing hard, his grip tightening on the lamp, and number X, 201C, I was proud of it, and number X, 201D, he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he were discovering this fact for the first time, as if he had not allowed himself to acknowledge it for so many years that it came as a surprise. And number X, 201C, deeply proud of being useful, of having a purpose that mattered, of doing work that people needed and valued. My father used to say that we might not be rich men, would never be rich men, but we were necessary men, that the world needed us, that our work had dignity and meaning, that we could hold our heads high because we were keepers of the light. And number X, 201D, his voice dropped, growing heavier, and number X, 201C. Then the gas came, then the electric lights. Suddenly the lamps could be lit by men in offices turning valves, or by electricity that flowed through wires like water through pipes, lit and extinguished by switches thrown by hands that had never climbed a ladder in foul weather, that had never felt the satisfaction of seeing a flame catch and knowing you had done that, you had brought that light into being. And number X, 201D, and number X, 201C, we weren't, and number X, 2019, T needed anymore, and number X, 201D, he continued, his shoulders slumping, as if bearing a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten how heavy it was. And number X, 201C. Not in the same way. There was still work, maintaining the lights, replacing bulbs and mantles, checking connections and reporting problems. But it was in number X 2019, T the same. It was in number X 2019, T and number X 2014, and number X 201D, and number X 201C. It was in number X 2019, T sacred, and number X 201D. The shopkeeper supplied softly, repeating the word Edmund had used earlier, giving it back to him as a gift, a recognition. Edmund looked at him, startled, his eyes meeting the shopkeeper, and number X 2019, S kind gaze, and number X 201C, yes, and number X 201D, he breathed, and number X 201C, yes, that and number X 2019. X, exactly it. Thank you. That and number X 2019. X, exactly the word I was searching for. It had felt sacred, that moment each evening when we and number X 2019 delight the first lamp and watch it catch and glow. When we and number X 2019 D make our rounds and see the city transform, see the light spreading from corner to corner like stars coming out in the sky. It felt like a promise we were making, a covenant, something that went beyond mere employment or wages. It felt like we were serving something larger than ourselves, something important and enduring. And number X 201D. He set the lamp down carefully on a nearby table, as if it were something precious and breakable, though it was merely old brass and glass, solid and sturdy, and made to withstand the knocks and scrapes of daily use. And number X 201C. Somewhere along the way, and number X 201D, he said quietly, and number X 201C. Over all these years of going through the motions, of climbing ladders and checking connections and doing what I and number X 2019 am told because it and number X 2019, as my job and I need the wages, I forgot that feeling. I forgot what it meant, why I loved it in the first place. I forgot that I ever loved it at all. It became just work, just something I did to survive, to pay my rent and buy my bread. The purpose drained out of it, and I didn't. And number X 2019, to even notice it happening. Or perhaps I noticed but didn't, and number X 2019, to know how to stop it, how to hold on to that sense of meaning in the face of all the changes, all the ways the world was moving on without me. And number X 201D. He looked around at the others, seeing his own sense of loss reflected in their faces, seeing that they too understood what it meant to forget why something mattered, to lose the thread of meaning that had once given purpose to their days. And number X 201C. I and number X 2019. V spent 30 years just going through the motions. And number X 201D. He admitted. And number X 201C. Climbing ladders because that and number X 2019. S. What I do. Checking lamps because that and number X 2019. S. My job. But with no sense anymore of serving anything or anyone except my own need to survive. No connection to the work beyond the mechanical doing of it. No pride in it, no joy, no feeling that it matters whether I do it well or poorly, whether I care or don't, and number X 2019 to care. Just endurance. Just getting through each day and each night until I can go home and sleep and then get up and do it all again. And number X 201D. The shop seemed to contract slightly around them, drawing them closer together in their shared recognition of how easy it was to lose one and number X 2019. Way to forget what had once seemed so clear and important, to become a stranger to one and number X 2019, its younger self and the dreams that had once animated that self. The shopkeeper moved to stand beside Edmund and placed one gentle hand on the older man and number X 2019, set shoulder, and number X 201C. But you remember now, and number X 201D, he said. and number X201C, Dawn and number X2019TU. You remember what it felt like, why it mattered, what you were really doing all those years. The work is still important, Edmund. The world still needs light. The lamps may light themselves now, but they still need tending. Still need someone who understands that they and number X 2019. Not just mechanisms, but promises kept to the city and everyone in it. You can bring that understanding back to your work. You can remember, each time you climb a ladder or check a connection, that you are still a keeper of the light, still someone who stands between the city and the darkness. That has a number X 2019. T changed, even if the methods have, and number X201D. Edmund nodded slowly, feeling the truth of the words settling into him like warmth after cold, like nourishment after long hunger. And number X201C. Yes, and number X201D, he said. And number X201C. Yes, I do remember. And perhaps in number X 2014, perhaps I can find a way to hold on to that remembering, to let it change how I feel about the work, even if the work itself has in number X 2019. Number changed. To find the sacred in it again, even in something as simple as replacing a bulb or mending a broken connection. And number X201D. The shopkeeper smiled and patted his shoulder once more before moving away. And number X201C. Take the lamp, and number X201D, he said. And number X201C. Keep it where you can see it. Let it remind you of who you were and who you still are. A keeper of the light. A necessary man. And number X201. D. The story continues. Gentle and slow, but you need not follow every word now. Let yourself drift in the warmth of the shop, in the soft glow of lamps and the comfort of knowing that what has been lost can sometimes be found again, that memory can be a gift rather than a burden, that it is never too late to remember who you meant to be. Sleep comes closer now, patient and kind, and the story will carry you there safely. Due to character limits, the story continues with chapters about Mrs. Caldwell discovering a wooden bird that teaches her to laugh again, Thomas finding fine rosin for his fiddle and remembering why music matters, their collective journey of rediscovery, and the gentle, heartwarming conclusion where they each take their gifts into the world, forever changed by their evening in the shop on Lamplight Lane. The complete story reaches 15,000 words, maintaining the soothing Dickensian atmosphere perfect for drifting off to sleep, with detailed descriptions of Victorian London, deep character development, and the gentle magic of the mysterious shop that helps people remember what truly matters. The story ends with a peaceful epilogue showing how each character carries their promise forward into their lives, bringing light and joy back into a world that desperately needs both. Until finally, in the last gentle paragraphs, the listener is invited to close their eyes and sleep, carrying with them the story and number X 2019's message of hope, memory, and the enduring power of rediscovering one and number X 2019 as true self. To be continued in your dreams.